In the early 1890s, William T. Love envisioned a canal connecting the two levels of the Niagara River separated by Niagara Falls. He believed it would serve the area's industries which needed hydroelectric power. He began to envision a perfect urban area called Model City, and prepared a plan that called for the construction of a vast community of beautiful parks and homes. Because of the Panic of 1893, which caused investors to no longer support the project, he was barely able to start digging the canal and only built a few streets and homes before his money ran out. Only 1 mile of the canal, about 50 feet wide and 1 to 40 feet deep, was ever dug.
Sometime in the 1920s, the canal became a dumping site for the municipality of Niagara Falls. By the 1940s, a company by the name of Hooker Chemical Company started dumping chemical waste into Love Canal. This dump site was in operation until 1952, in which 21,000 tons of alkalines, fatty acids, and chlorinated hydrocarbons were dumped into the canal. Then they covered the canal with topsoil, and grass soon started to grow.
The Niagara Falls School Board needed land and attempted to purchase property from Hooker Chemical that had not been already used to bury chemical waste. Hooker refused to sell, knowing the safety concerns, and even took members of the school board to the canal to show the toxic chemicals below the surface. However, the board refused to give up. Eventually, Hooker Chemical agreed to sell only on the condition that the board buys the entire property for $1. In the agreement signed on April 28, 1953, Hooker included a stipulation that explained the dangers of building on the site. Hooker was then released from all legal obligations should lawsuits arise in the future.
Despite the disclaimer which stated that there were industrial wastes buried in the ground, the board began construction on the 99th Street School in its originally intended location. In January 1954, the architect for the school wrote to the Education Committee informing them that during excavation, workers discovered 2 dump sites filled with 55-gallon drums containing chemical waste. The architect also noted that it would be poor policy to build in that area since it was not known what wastes were present in the ground, and thus the concrete foundation might be subsequently damaged. The school board then moved the school site 80 to 85 feet further north. The kindergarten playground also had to be relocated because a chemical dump lay directly beneath. Upon completion of the school in 1955, 400 children attended the academic institution. That same year, a 25-foot area crumbled, exposing toxic chemical drums, which then filled with water during rainstorms. This created large puddles that children enjoyed playing in.
In 1957, the city of Niagara Falls constructed sewers for a mixture of low-income and single-family residents to be built on lands adjacent to the landfill site. While building the gravel sewer beds, construction efforts broke through the clay seal, again breaching the walls of the canal. The land on which the new homes were being built was not part of the agreement between the school board and Hooker, and thus none of the families knew the history of the canal. There was no monitoring or regulating of the chemical waste which were being stored under the ground. Following the exceptionally wet winter and spring of 1977, the water turned the breached canal into an overflowing pool. People reported having puddles of oil or colored liquids in their yards and basements.
Can you make decisions? Are you going to live there with your wife? Are you going to put your kids there?
We are here with Lois Gibbs from the Love Canal Homeowners Association. How does your story begin?
I was sort of a regular housewife buying the American dream in 1978. I moved into this lovely home in Niagara Falls. It wasn't a spectacular home. It was a ranch, 3-bedroom ranch with a finished basement, a short distance from the Niagara River. I mean, huge Niagara River, 5 miles upstream of Niagara Falls. It had 2 elementary schools. It had churches. It had a convenience store. It was a perfect neighborhood. And so I moved in there with my husband and my 1-year-old child, thinking I've just made the American dream at 24 years of age. I mean, my parents waited so long, very happy. And then after living there for a while, Michael got really sick.
What types of symptoms did your son experience?
He developed liver problems, urinary tract disorder, which required 2 operations to correct. He developed asthma, epilepsy. I mean, it was just one thing after the other. And I did not know about Love Canal. Nobody told me when I bought that ideal home in the ideal community that there was 20,000 tons of chemicals underneath the school that my son would eventually be attending. And so Michael got sick and sicker, and I kept taking him to the doctor, and asking the pediatrician, and he had no clue. He's like, you know, God gave you this child because you're one of these moms that he knows will take care of him. It's like, no, God gave me a healthy child. Something is making him sick.
How did you finally learn about all these chemicals that were under your school and homes?
It wasn't until I picked up the newspaper one day, and there was a series on hazardous waste done by Michael Brown in the Niagara Falls Gazette, and I looked at it, and it talked about 20,000 tons of chemicals underneath the 99th Street School and leaking out into the homes. And they had a list of all these different chemicals in there, and so I took it over to my brother-in-law, who worked at SUNY Buffalo, the university there. He's a biologist. And I said, Wayne, what are these chemicals? They say toxic chemicals. I don't know what that means. And he said, well, let me see. This one will kill about 1 million brain cells when you take one deep breath. And he went through this whole list, and I'm like, Wayne, Michael's really sick. Do you think these chemicals and him playing on the playground every day, even though he wasn't yet in school, could be making him sick? And he said, I have no doubt. And so I went to the school board and said, can you move Michael out of the school? By then he was in kindergarten, 1978. This is when the article ran. And they said, no, we cannot, because if we move Michael Gibbs because of the potential threat, we have to move all 407 children. And I'm like, yeah, you need to move all 407 children. We're not going to do that. We're not closing a school because of one irate, hysterical housewife. And I went home saying, oh my goodness. I said, it's just unbelievable. And then I started to go door to door to my neighbors and said what I found. The city government was not moving. The county government shut the door in my face. The state government shut the door in my face. And obviously the school board, Dr. Long, who was the superintendent of schools at the time, slammed the door in my face.
What did you do when you found out what these toxins would do to you and your children?
And so I did a petition and went door to door and said, look, you know, do you have problems with your kids? I think it's related to the school. But we never did have, at the onset of discovery of the problem, we never really understood the dimensions of what was happening at Love Canal. We truly believed that our children were getting sick as a result of playing on the playground or as a result of going to school there and playing on the playground. We didn't know it really was traveling into our homes and into our backyards and into our bodies in that way. The area where Love Canal was a new neighborhood. You know, those homes were fairly new. So there was a lot of land where you could have built a school. You didn't need to build it there. It wasn't like you're in the South Bronx or something like that where you have a finite amount of property available. There was plenty of property available, and they chose that. And it was a dollar deal.
Do you think the school board was aware of all the toxic chemicals and waste that was in the canal?
Well, they knew that the property was contaminated. The school board knew that, and the city knew that. They knew that there was industrial waste buried there because there was a waiver that said in the deed, if anyone gets sick or harmed from our industrial waste, we will not be responsible. So they knew that. Whether they understood the depth of that, because we're really talking 1950 here, so it was a different world and a different understanding, is unclear.
What happened when it went to the New York Supreme Court?
But one thing that did happen is when it went to the Supreme Court, when the government tried to get their money back for the testing, the cleanup, the relocation of the Love Canal families, New York Supreme Court decided that Occidental Petroleum, in fact, did know more, did not disclose that information to the school board, not making the school board necessarily innocent, but less guilty than a lot of people think. And so they were held responsible for Love Canal, Occidental Petroleum, to the tune of $197 million. Huge price tag.